Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
Welcome back to the Solid Verbal, boys and girls. My name is Ty Hildenbrandt. As always, that fine gentleman over there, you know him well. His name is Dan Rubenstein. Sir, welcome. Welcome to our first schedule preview for the 23 season. How you doing?
It's a nice little signifier, Ty, right? That it's almost summerish, and summerish means where we turn our gaze forward. And we've been doing like bigger picture shows with 8-ish win, 10-ish win. We've been doing sort of deep dives on, that year one debrief, but that's sort of us floating around in information to just try to sort it all out. But now, right, as I just said, we're adjusting our gaze forward, and it feels like the first right of the season. Does that make any sense?
Oh,
a little bit?
Totally.
Yeah. I'm excited for this. Look, I'm so excited. My voice is starting to go. So my body is overwhelmed, is what I'm telling you.
Very excited to be with you all today. It is sort of the preview to the preview. We're going to be talking about schedules. We're not necessarily talking about over-unders or team expectations, that type of thing, though some of the conversation may lead there today. It is SEC. All things SEC scheduling. We're going to break down the toughest schedules, the easiest schedules, the craziest stretches, the teams that have traps, the teams that are gumpy. We'll explain what that means, etc., etc., etc. If you are just finding us for the first time, make sure you hit subscribe or follow on your podcasting app of choice. We'd appreciate that. Also, if you want to leave a star rating or a review, that helps. Don't forget to follow on social media. And if you are ever so inclined, go on out to verballers.com, VERBALLERS.com. That's our Patreon. That's where you can go if you want to further support the fine work that Dan Rubenstein and I do on a weekly and ongoing and continuous basis, because college football never ever sleeps, sir. Never ever sleeps.
No, absolutely not. Is there any news you want to get to? You want to jump right into scheduling stuff? Where are we going?
I want to talk about SEC schedules. We have a sound, Dan.
This is... It's sort of an accomplishment sound from Tecmo Super Bowl. You made the playoffs.
That's right.
So this we're going to repurpose as we made it to this point of the calendar. And I'm pretty happy about that accomplishment.
I am as well. So look, schedules are out now and win totals are out. We are beginning the slow climb up the hill / down the hill into the 2023 season. And where we started last year and many years prior is by looking at the schedule and at least setting the stage here for what appears to be, look, it's the SEC. It's going to be an awesome season. And there are a number of non-conference games that we'll get into and talk about what the ramifications are. We'll obviously drizzle in win totals because I think that adds important context. But as you look across the board here, I recall last year when we looked at the Big 12 schedule, I recall even moments where we looked at the Pac-12 and Big 10 schedules from a year ago, where we said, wow, this really figures to be like kind of a crazy season, right? Like we understand that we're going to get into week 10 and things are going to feel like they're coming off the swivel a little bit. And as I looked across the SEC schedule this year, there are certainly moments of that for teams that we can get into where it feels like, okay, if something's going to go south, this is when it's going to happen. But on the whole, I was really heartened by what I saw. You've got teams like Alabama that are playing really tough non-conference opponents. LSU playing really tough non-conference opponents. Even weird games like Mizzou has, I think, Kansas State. There are some interesting non-conference
That's fun, man. That rules.
I mean, they're just some really interesting non-conference opponents. And I think often the SEC gets a bad rap. You hear people talk about it out on Twitter about, they don't play anybody, or they're playing Wofford or Samson or whoever. But there are a lot of good non-conference opponents on here that I think will give the SEC a chance to shine.
Yeah, Mizzou playing Kansas State, by the way, is sort of the LA Gear border war, right? Where it's not the full pump. You're like, look, Reebok pumps the full pumps. LA Gear, yes, you made pumps, but it's not the real pump. Listen, as a proud owner of LA Gear pumps, I'm fine with it. But there is something that's a little bit off about those two teams. Look, I celebrate, and I'm going to watch that game. I have a request for you. So we're talking gumpiness, which we can explain. I believe you have a sound.
I must have drank me about 15 Dr. Pepper.
Yeah.
The best way I can define gumpiness is the team that keeps finding itself in interesting situations, high-profile situations like Forrest Gump at various points of history with various historical figures. And the team that finds itself sandwiched between other big games or in a letdown spot or a week before a bye where a team might be looking ahead to that bye, something like that, where the team just finds itself in a certain place. I have another introduction. I have a thing I want to introduce that is even stupider.
Oh, beautiful. That's what we're here for.
I want us to identify the stretches. And I don't have a sound for this. I apologize. I thought of this during our introduction. I want us to identify the stretches that are especially tenuous for each team. And those are going to be our fettuccine Alfredo moments to carbo load a la Michael Scott. I have never eaten more fettuccine Alfredo and drank less water in my entire life, which if I'm in a down place and I think about that specific moment on The Office, it is an almost guarantee to flip my mood. Michael Scott just demolishing fettuccine Alfredo before running a 5K.
We will find a way to get that sound and incorporate it, I promise you. But yeah,
the fettuccine Alfredo moment. Yeah,
I'm down for that. Where do you want to start here? Should we start with the defending champion, Georgia Bulldogs?
I say yes.
Georgia's over-under is 11.5 wins. One of the categories that you and I called out here when we were trying to put all this together is which SEC team, which any conference team as we go through all of them, has the easiest schedule. You can make a really strong case that the defending back-to-back national champions have the easiest schedule. They will face nary a challenge, Dan, in the first 8 weeks of the season. As I read through this thing, I kept waiting for it to get harder. And it's kind of amazing because it never really does. Not when you're starting from a point like where Georgia is starting from, where they've got all the talent in the world. Of course, there's some turnover, new quarterback. There are things that Kirby Smart needs to address. But beyond that, beyond sort of that high level vantage point on this looks easy in Georgia terms, you've got obviously the Florida game. That's a neutral sider in week 9 in Jacksonville against Florida. You've got Mizzou at home. You've got Ole Miss on the road. You've got Tennessee on the road in week 12, which is probably the toughest game on this thing. And then they close out with clean old-fashioned hate, another rivalry game against Georgia Tech. But no real traps that jump out to me. And I think a really good way to start this season at home against UT Martin and Ball State, to break in a new quarterback, to work out any kinks that they might have from some of the turnover that they've had to endure. This seems like another really good set up here for the Georgia Bulldogs to make another run at this thing.
Yeah, this is a sort of capital I if, right? Like if Auburn is pretty good, okay, then that changes the tenor of what we think this schedule looks like, right? If Florida's pretty good, they both get the bye. It's hard to construct that, competent scaffolding right now for Florida's offense. We'll see. Mizzou, they're not going to probably struggle with because that's in Athens this year. Tennessee, as you mentioned, is the big, the circled game. Ole Miss is interesting, at least a little bit more interesting as of this morning. Keon Coleman I don't think anything's official yet at time of this recording, but, adding some firepower out wide, that's something, I suppose. But right now it's difficult to find the exact scenario unless somebody is just over the top better than, I'll speak for myself. Like if South Carolina continues that momentum, it'd be saucier if that game were in Columbia. It certainly would be. That would be the game I would circle given relatively recent history between those two programs. But right now, no, this is all on Georgia. There's very little outside external noise that is affecting my pick to go over the 11.5 pick right now. Just because 2 games in, 3 games in, and we see that the offense isn't humming, quarterback isn't working out, whatever. All right, that's a different story. But until we get to that point, I can in good conscience take the under unless something turns out to be different than I perceive it to be in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, they basically have 7 weeks to get the quarterback thing figured out.
Right.
They have 7 weeks to get it figured out before they go on bye, and then they play Florida, Mizzou, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Georgia Tech, close out the season. That should be more than sufficient for Kirby Smart.
So what's the scariest moment before the bye in those first 7 weeks?
Scariest moment before the bye, probably early at home against South Carolina.
Okay.
Because South Carolina feels like the ultimate wild card. We'll talk about them here momentarily. South Carolina feels like a big-time wild card to me. I'm not so concerned about Auburn. I know that's a rivalry game. But Auburn, I think, is going to need more time to get their roster figured out. I thought about Kentucky as well. We can talk about Kentucky. A lot of new at Kentucky that gives me cause for pause. Our favorite.
Maybe good new, right?
Maybe good new. Could be good new. But if you're a Georgia fan, you got to feel pretty good about this.
I think South Carolina, just because that'll be the first time, presumably, Carson Beck is going to see a full speed defense, even though it's at home, which is nice. But that's the first time, really, the weight of expectations, especially if he is sort of up and down early on. Who knows? But I think it's South Carolina that first moment. Though, again, at Auburn, a lot new. I'm not crazy about. I still wouldn't put money on the Tigers at this point, but I think those are the trip-up spots, obviously.
Georgia's rival, one of Georgia's rival, Florida Bulldogs. Florida Gators, excuse me.
You're okay.
Over-under is 5.5. That raised eyebrows.
Mm-hmm.
Vegas is not giving the Florida Gators any benefit of the doubt here. The schedule is one of the oddest things I think I've come across. It's not quite gumpy from the standpoint of Texas Tech last year being gumpy, catching all of their opponents in weird situations.
Mm-hmm.
Every odd-numbered week, Florida has a tough football game. Every odd-numbered week. Think about that. Week 1, on the road at Utah. 2 weeks later, it's home against Tennessee. 2 weeks later, it's at Kentucky, which I think with where Florida's at will be a pretty difficult game. 2 weeks later at South Carolina, that could obviously be tricky. 2 weeks later, it's Georgia, the neutral sider. 2 weeks later at LSU. 2 weeks later, they close out the year with freaking Florida State. So not only is it a very, very difficult schedule in and of itself, but there really isn't a long stretch where they could get themselves together. They go right from Utah down to McNeese State, but then back to Tennessee, down to Charlotte. On the road at Kentucky, Vandy in between, going to South Carolina before a bye week. It's a very, very complex schedule in a super peculiar way. There are a couple other teams across the SEC that have a similar setup to their schedule, but this to me is, I couldn't figure out if this is a good thing or a bad thing if you're a Florida fan. Obviously, you want more easy games. That means more wins. But I totally get the 5.5 over-under after looking at this thing. They've also got Arkansas in a bit of a letdown look-ahead sandwich.
Definitely.
In between Georgia and LSU, two teams that could definitely be contenders.
And that's Arkansas coming off a bye, to be clear.
Arkansas coming off a bye, absolutely. So this thing is chock full of landmines for the Gators. And I'm still inclined to say over. I know this isn't the over-under show, but Florida as the SEC oddball in the most literal sense, because of the way the schedule sets up, is not something I had initially thought of before I looked at the schedule.
So here's the good news. Cam Rising might not be playing in that game. He tore his ACL against Penn State. I don't know the status of his rehabilitation, and even if he's playing, that's game number 1 for Cam Rising coming off a torn ACL. The bad news is it's at Utah. It's in Salt Lake City. It's at altitude. You know how I feel about that. I don't expect you to have your, hawk soaring sound right now at the ready. Maybe you do, maybe you don't as I buy time. But, it's still tricky. It's still difficult. It's still a Utah defense. You're right about the what I'm going to call treacherous lily pads as they try to hop over maybe some snapping turtles or something along the way. It's not great. If you're going to construct 6 wins for me on this schedule, I'm going to slide into injured Cam Rising Utah as 1, maybe. McNeese is 2. Charlotte is 3. Vandy at home. They recently lost to Vandy, but I'll give it to them at home. That's
Recent
4.
Vandy loser, 4.
Right. That's 4. If you want to say at Mizzou, if they're a bit discombobulated, that's 5. And that's sandwiched between, as you mentioned, at LSU and Florida State. That's 5.
By the way,
yeah.
Oh, look at that sandwich.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry.
Oh, boy.
I was delinquent in my duties in not playing that sound. I do have the altitude sound, by the way, in case.
Oh, that's good too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So if we're going to say, if they get more than we think out of quarterback, Graham Mertz or whoever, if they get more than we think, if they get B+ quarterback play, and the offense is more cohesive and the running game is where it showed itself to be last year, even with some new offensive linemen, what does that change for you? Like, what does it swing on, right? The over-under, is there a specific game that you've circled on this Florida schedule? Like, they're going over if quarterback play is pretty good and the offense is a B+. That means they can beat Kentucky. They can beat South Carolina. Like, what is that 50-50 game to you a couple months out of the season?
I think it might be Arkansas, just because because of the way that game sets up. Yeah, because it's in between Georgia and LSU. That to me is a really, really tender spot in the schedule. And you're right to mention Mizzou also sandwiched in between LSU and Florida State, two really tough opponents that Florida's going to be looking forward to playing both. That stretch to me is probably one of the weirdest stretches. One of the things we want to identify here is odd stretches as well. After Florida goes on bye in week 8, when they close out their season, Georgia, Arkansas, at LSU, at Mizzou, Florida State, that's where we're going to find out what this team's made of. It's significantly easier before that point in the season. And so I think maybe we get to Arkansas and it's still an open question.
Yeah, and also, let's just be clear. Look, last year they have an NFL starting quarterback in Anthony Richardson, who obviously physically more talented than maybe anybody in the country. But even a down Florida team gave Tennessee all it could handle on the road, right? Now they have the Vols at home.
Yep.
And so I just assume, because Florida has had kind of a weird offseason, though, I just assume in year 2, things will be more cohesive in terms of Billy Napier's vision, where they were all over the place last year.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So I think there is part of me, even though there is a ton of reason for concern with Florida, there is part of me that says the culture should be more intact, hypothetically, and by the time they get to the bye week, they'll have a better sense of themselves. And even if, they lose to Georgia by 2 or 3 touchdowns or something, this is an Arkansas team that had a pretty bad defense. This is an LSU team that Florida always seems to compete with, well or not. Mizzou could have a terrible offense this year, and Florida State, even when Florida State is good and Florida's down, Florida somehow makes that a game at the very least. So if Billy Napier is able to win those 50-50 types, we might be talking about 8-4, 9-3 Florida, because that defense could be that good and that fast if everything breaks. I think it's Austin Armstrong is the name of the new DC.
Yep.
I'm not ready to like just sort of guess on Florida because I doubt them. I can absolutely see this going comfortably over.
So could I, and I still think I'm inclined to go over. But I get the line a little bit more after studying the schedule. It is one of the tougher schedules in the SEC. It is also very odd for the reasons I described earlier.
Did you take the over-under with Georgia, by the way?
I would be inclined to go over. This is not the over-under show.
Oh, okay.
But looking at this,
I have it listed here. I have it listed on my document, so that's why I asked.
But looking at this, I'd be inclined to go over. I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive.
Okay.
Before I give out my picks, I'd be inclined to go over though. Feels like
so that'll happen during preview time. We'll make our over/under picks.
I think closer to that. Yeah.
Great.
When we have a little bit more information. Where do you want to go next, Dan? What team interests you next?
Let's go to Alabama. Let's go out west.
Let's go.
Actually, no.
West.
LSU on the west. Let's go to your guy Brian Kelly and the Tigers.
My guy Brian Kelly. How dare you?
Yeah.
First off, LSU Florida State is an absolute week 1 banger.
Yeah.
I am fired up for that game. I saw the early line is Florida State favored by 1. That will probably change a handful of times by the time people listen to this, certainly by the time the game rolls around first week of the season. But absolute banger. That is a neutral site game. They're playing it in Orlando. LSU will travel. Obviously, Florida State will travel as well. Great atmosphere for a game. Here's the weird thing about LSU's schedule. LSU's over-under is 9.5 this year, which makes sense. A lot of good teams on here. They've got the Florida State game to start things off. They're also on the road at Bama in week 10. Weirdly, it does not feel like it's that tough of a schedule to me. Going to Bama is going to be tough. You're not going to be in the SEC West and come out of this thing without a tough road game. You're not going to go the full season without having a scare 1 or 2 times from a team that you wouldn't expect to give you a scare. But I look at this thing and I say the true road games outside of the neutral site or against Florida State are Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and Mizzou. If everything else is at home and you've got non-con opponents like Grambling and Army and Georgia State, I feel pretty good about their chances here, Dan. It gets significantly tougher in the month of November. We'll know a lot more by December, I promise you. In November, it's Alabama, Florida, Georgia State, whatever. close out
It's
the year
at
against,
Alabama, to be clear. This
at
year.
Alabama,
Yeah.
and then close out the year against Texas A&M. So that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where we're really going to find out what LSU's made of deep into the season. But beyond that, this to me feels like a really nice setup to take another run at this thing.
I think so. At Mississippi State is a bit of a wild card just because we don't know what to expect out of Zach Arnett's program, what the offense is going to look like. We kind of have a concept of what the defense is going to look like, but that's a wild card just because that is always a tough road environment. Ole Miss's defense is not putting the fear of life, the fear of death in me at this moment. At Mizzou doesn't scare me terribly. No, you're right that the first part of this schedule after Florida State, I'm not saying it's easy. That Arkansas game was weird and ugly and very losable last year, again, on the icy turf, the icy field. I love this schedule. I love this schedule for them with what they're returning and a coach that I just can depend on. My question to you, because I think it's still relevant, did you always feel great about Notre Dame in week one and some of those bigger week one matchups? Did Brian Kelly have Notre Dame ready? Last year he didn't.
No.
Because of the special teams miscues. I think they had like a 2.5 quarter scare against Louisville way back when, maybe a Puma pass game, something like that.
Right.
That's a non-sample size, but week one in Orlando, it'll be more Florida State probably. I feel really good about that being an incredible game. And right now I think I'd lean Florida State just because of the home field and the chaos of week one. But I think LSU is going to be better than they were last year, so I'm not confident in that pick.
No, I'm not confident in that pick at all. And I do think, though, I'll reiterate it.
Yeah.
I think LSU's in a really good spot with the schedule.
Schedule's great.
It sets up about as well as you could expect if you want to try and repeat on that side of the conference. So I like it. I like it for year two and Brian Kelly. They will be better. They've got to get through Florida State week one. But if they do, it's pretty much smooth sailing. Now, I say pretty much because you always have landmines in the SEC. We'll talk about
3 out of 4 weeks on the road.
3 out of 4 weeks on the road.
State, that's the fettuccine Alfredo moment to me.
Yeah.
That you just have to make sure everything is all right in your stomach, that you have the stomach to go through that stretch, even though it's just a 5K tie.
Yeah.
I think it's treacherous still.
All right. Let's go over to Alabama now.
Okay.
Alabama's over-under is 10.5 this year. It is undeniably one of the toughest schedules in the SEC. It's spaced out fairly well. There are good buffers.
Buffer zone.
Got some good buffers in there. I think the Texas game in week 2 could be a really good game. The early line has Bama favored by 7 at home, which makes sense. I could see that one going up the closer we get to kickoff. But what I like about this schedule for Alabama, despite the fact that they play really good teams, is that most of the tough games are at home. Most of them are at home. Texas, Tennessee, and LSU, those are tough opponents. All of those games are at home. A&M's on the road. That'll be a challenge. Auburn's on the road, obviously a rivalry, though they don't scare me as much because they're kind of starting over this year. But I like that setup, at least for Bama. I did see some commentary this week, and I think it was from our friend Josh Pate, who pushed back on the notion that there's anything to worry about with Bama, especially given the fact that the over-under is 10.5. I respect that viewpoint, but to paraphrase the wise prophet Eminem, he don't know Tommy Rees and Tyler Buckner the way I do, Slim. You don't know these two guys the way I know them after watching the last couple years. And so that concerns me about Alabama. I get it. They're going to have a ton of talent. I get it. You can't really get that worried about Bama in its present state under Nick Saban. They're in a really good spot. They have talent in more places than any other team, maybe outside of Georgia and Ohio State. It's kind of comical, but we've seen it happen before. If you put the wrong guy at quarterback, or if you've got a system on offense that's out of sync going up against a good offense or a good defense or a team that's maybe more together early in the season, Texas A&M. Can't say Texas A&M for that one, but you get my point. Anything's possible, especially in the early weeks of college football. And if Tyler Buckner is the guy, I feel confident in the under for Alabama. I am still not sold on Tommy Rees. I've never really been. And
you constantly are making reference to, but not specifically saying the golden infection.
The golden.
The Tommy Rees, Tyler Buckner golden infection of Alabama. Continue.
I'm just saying that I think we should consider the ramifications of that tandem for Alabama. That, of course, is not the same conversation as the schedule. From a scheduling standpoint, there's a lot to like here, despite the fact that I believe it's probably the toughest schedule in the SEC. But Alabama will be fine. There's a reason the over-under is 10.5. It's just, does this schedule scare you enough, Dan, into totally separate from the conversation about offense and who's playing quarterback and that whole rigmarole? Does the schedule sway you in one direction or the other?
Yes, I think so. I think I would take the under. I think I see them going 10-2 just because, look, I'm not sold on any one of these specific teams, but having A&M after the Mississippi schools on the road at Kyle Field, Arkansas, Tennessee, I'm not crazy scared of Arkansas in this moment in that matchup because it's at home in Tuscaloosa. But look, if Tennessee is just firing with Joe Milton, if LSU is great, and that game's in Tuscaloosa one more time. So, like, they lose those two games last year, both on the road, both tight. They are like 45 seconds in a gust of wind from being undefeated last year. So I recognize that, but Bryce Young isn't walking through that door, as you mentioned. So not terribly worried about Kentucky or Chattanooga, not terribly worried about Auburn on the road, but Iron Bowl always seems to be closer. You always got to throw the records out, Ty.
Always got to throw the records out.
Always got to throw them out. So I just think it's just too filled with danger right now, and there's too much uncertainty on offense at quarterback right now that has me a little bit concerned, Ty. I'm not there with Alabama right now. I think they're going to be really good, but in terms of combining quarterback and schedule, it's the old made-up phrase, you are until you aren't. And so Alabama's Alabama until they're not.
Yeah.
And you throw in that golden infection, I'm not there. I'm just not there right now.
If Buckner's the guy, I'm a definite under, by the way.
Okay.
It's FYI. Definite under.
Fair enough.
Which of the remaining schedules, there are many, did you find most intriguing?
Mizzou's is interesting, although I don't know if Mizzou itself is super interesting, just because they're my Gumpy team. If you have
Are they your Gumpy team?
They are my Gumpy team.
About 15 Dr. Peppers.
Yeah. Mizzou's over under 6.5, not the over under show, Dan, of course, but over unders ultimately come down to belief. And do you believe in the team and the roster and the coaches, and do you believe what they can do against the schedule? To that end, this schedule is screaming infidelities to me. It is screaming. It is. I can believe in 4 wins.
Who's Mizzou cheating on?
I don't know. They're cheating on me. I could get behind 4, 5, maybe 6 wins if you get a couple drinks in me. 7 wins? Are you kidding me? No chance. Not against this. Why is Mizzou Gumpy to you?
Was that a very low-key, subtle Drinkwitz reference? Getting some drinks in you?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay. So Mizzou this year, so they have Vandy between when Vandy plays Kentucky and they're at Florida. So they're sort of sandwiched in there because Kentucky is hypothetically a winnable moment for the Doors this year.
Yep.
They have LSU after LSU is at Ole Miss and before they play Auburn. They are playing Kentucky after Kentucky gets Florida and before they're at Georgia. They have South Carolina between Florida and when the Gamecocks go to Texas A&M. They have Georgia after Florida, after Georgia has Florida. Tennessee after the Vols have Mizzou before Georgia. Florida before they travel to LSU, and then after they travel to LSU before they travel to Florida State. Mizzou is just sandwiched in there. They're just cold cuts this year.
Cold cuts.
They are the boar's head.
The boar's head. Yeah. This is a tough schedule, though, for Mizzou. It's going to be tough to navigate this. We had this conversation a lot last year when we talked about Texas Tech. And I do think there were moments where it did work to their advantage, certainly from a betting standpoint. But in terms of actually winning games, this is going to be a pivotal year for Eli Drinkwitz. He's got to get that offense figured out. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to do so. They bring in a new offensive coordinator. There is some conversation around who the opening day starter will be. I don't think fans want to hear more from Brady Cook. Everyone's ready to move on in that sense.
Right.
But it could be. Eli Drinkwitz kind of gave him his vote of confidence here after spring. there's just so much that they got to sort out on the offensive side of the ball. And they don't have a whole lot of time to do it. I mean, week 1 against South Dakota, sure, they can probably win that game. But I do think we can have a conversation about Middle Tennessee and Memphis being better, not necessarily pushovers. Kansas State, we know, isn't a pushover. They won the damn division conference last year, the Big 12. And then as they crack into the SEC slate here, they might be gumpy, but there are some tough road games that I think they're going to have to contend with.
Take a bunch of unders with Mizzou, right? They might just be the whoopee cushion of the conference that's just sliding in and making things uncomfortable. Sliding in and making things uncomfortable. They hit the Mizzou games last season, hit the over 30% of the time. They were one of the more dependable under bets last year, just in terms of scoring points, obviously, not over under win totals. So Mizzou's going to be interesting. They're going to be a team throughout the season to be like, I know they seem like they are not going to compete with blah blah blah, but this is a moment where, like last year we saw it with Georgia, and that's one game that was relatively early on in the season, but the schedule is such where it might be easy for teams to overlook Mizzou at their own peril.
Yeah, and that's sort of Eli Drinkwitz's MO, isn't it? He's a fiery guy. He's able to get guys playing for him. So my gumpy team, by the way,
I must have drank me about 15 Dr. Peppers.
Kentucky Wildcats. Kentucky's schedule this year is tailor-made to break in a new quarterback.
Yes.
To reintroduce a new old coordinator in Liam Cohen, to go into battle with a lousy offensive line that returns 4 guys from last season.
Mm-hmm.
When you start your season, Ball State, Eastern Kentucky, Akron, and at Vandy, Kentucky's back, baby. They're back.
Pretty
They're
nice.
4-0. They're 4-0. You're feeling good if you're a Kentucky Wildcat fan. But then you keep reading it, and it starts to look a little bit more like they got duped into agreeing to this in the first place. There's a little bit of an ACC grant of rights feel to this, where it's like, wait, they're cool with this? You look into this a little bit deeper. You've got Florida, then on the road against Georgia, back-to-back. You've got a closing stretch of Tennessee, at Mississippi State, home against Bama, at South Carolina, at Louisville for the Governor's Cup. That is a tough stretch. But it is worth noting, that Kentucky is kind of gumpy, right? Like you said, be a little bit cautious about Mizzou. Maybe be leery of Devin Leary.
Oh, man.
You don't want to be foregoing Liam Cohen.
You want to end up in the cone zone? Yeah.
They get Georgia after Georgia plays in the Auburn rivalry. They get Missouri after Missouri plays LSU. Tennessee after Tennessee has its big rematch with Bama. Mississippi State a week before they play A&M. Bama a week after they play LSU. South Carolina a week before South Carolina plays Clemson.
Yeah.
So at least on that side of things, I would probably give the nod to Kentucky in terms of gumpiness. They have interesting situations, albeit a very difficult schedule the remaining 8-9 weeks of the year.
Yeah, and it's easier in the SEC and somewhat in the Big 12, I would say, to find gumpiness because the floor is pretty high within the conference. You talk about the start of Kentucky's season, and you penciled in the win against Vandy. They almost beat Vandy last year, Ty.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I don't necessarily pencil it in because that game's in Nashville this year, I believe. So Kentucky is trying to improve things, and Mark Stoops is absolutely a winning coach and has led Kentucky teams who have been doubted to 8, 9, 10 wins. I'm just not penciling in anything right now with Kentucky, just based on where they struggled last year, getting absolutely annihilated by Tennessee the way that they did. It's a sort of wait and see for me with Kentucky because, as you mentioned, like everything can be gumpy, right? Big 12, there's the number of quality teams. I think Kentucky's quality, and I think the teams that they play are quality, but the phrase might be more apt in the ACC or the Pac-12 or the Big 10 when there are cushions to be had.
Yeah. Who else is interesting to you? I've got a long list here, but I'm curious to pick your brain. Outside of teams that are gumpy,
Right.
Are there any schedules that look particularly trappy to you?
It's more Tennessee's. I think it's their back half or their post-bye schedule. They've got the ultimate
trappy, right?
It's not even just trappy. It's fettuccine Alfredo, man. They got a carbo load real thoroughly.
It's a trap! It's a trap!
I was going to bring up Tennessee if you didn't bring them up next. Continue.
So Tennessee, after their bye week in week 6, I believe, it's Texas A&M, at Bama, at Kentucky, UConn. We're talking about bowl-eligible
UConn. Yep.
America's true independent team. At Mizzou, Georgia, Vandy. Now, not terribly scared of Vandy if I'm Tennessee, but it's both landminey and just filled with that sweet, sweet Alfredo sauce. So, Ty, give me your thoughts on this stretch or somewhere else on their schedule that has you intrigued.
I mean, on the road at Kentucky a week after that Bama rematch. Let's talk about that for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to make of Kentucky. I like Liam Cohen. I love Devin Leary. I don't know what the rest of the Kentucky offense looks like. We haven't gotten that far with our prep yet. We'll get there. I promise you. The over-under 6.5 for Kentucky. We know what Vegas thinks of them. They're a 6-7 win team. But Kentucky's been pretty good on defense for the...
Not against Tennessee lately.
Not
but
against Tennessee.
Otherwise, yeah.
But for the overwhelming majority of the time that the current regime has been in place, they've been able to figure out defense.
Mm-hmm.
We need to pay a little bit of attention to this situation. This is one of the trappiest games of the year because the emotion in that Tennessee-Alabama game will be so freaking high after what happened last year in Knoxville. Now they're going on the road to Tuscaloosa for the rematch. I don't think Tennessee will be in the same spot they were a year ago when they get to that matchup in week 8, but it's still going to be a pretty good team and emotion's going to run high. To come down off that high in a rivalry game to go on the road to Lexington? Dude.
It's a trap. It's a trap.
That's a trap if I've ever seen one. And then a week before going against Georgia, they're on the road at Mizzou. Again, Mizzou, a little bit gumpy in their own right. And they play with heart. I'm just saying those are two very, very trappy games. Tennessee's over-under is 9.5 this year. I wouldn't be so inclined to go over on that. I could see them dropping one of these two games that we mentioned. And there are plenty of other difficult games on here against Alabama, against Georgia, even against Florida. I don't think too highly of Florida.
It's on the road, though.
It's on the road. Texas A&M before Bama, after a bye in week 7. It's a really tough stretch here for Tennessee, the back half of the schedule. And 9.5 feels pretty aggressive to me, given some of the landmines here that may not necessarily be that obvious.
It's weird. You left one out, and I don't know how I feel about this yet. It's going to have to sort of marinate in my very dumb brain. But Frank Harris is back for UTSA, is he not?
Oh, man. Your boy, Big Frank.
7th year, Frank Harris. I don't know how I feel about the Roadrunners. I don't know exactly what they have coming back or what the roster is looking like right now. But at Florida and South Carolina with UTSA sandwiched in there, it's in Knoxville. I understand all of these things. Interesting. It's just interesting. And also just as it relates to your Kentucky point, how that's just going to be tricky in Lexington. It's not just Alabama before that. They have A&M's defensive line and then Alabama's defensive line to contend with before that Kentucky game. Yeah. It's just a lot to ask. And so if Joe Milton is awesome and he's able to get rid of the ball quickly, or he's just able to make those adjustments, and if he has that command of the offense that Hendon Hooker had last year, I'm not terribly worried. But that's a big if. That's a big if because A&M is going to be a problem on defense.
A&M, we will get to A&M here momentarily. Yeah. We need to talk about Ole Miss. I need your help in classifying this Ole Miss schedule.
Okay.
Ole Miss is over under 7.5. I was trying to think it through. The best I could do is that this schedule is equivalent to smoking near the gas pump, at least in the early part of the season. All right. This is the type of schedule that may not look intimidating, but you could see a loud bang and the whole thing sort of exploding even before we get to week 6.
Okay.
Here's what we're starting out with if you're Ole Miss. Now, bear in mind, there's a lot of new at Ole Miss. There's like a 3-way quarterback thing going on at the moment. They've taken on some transfers, right? I mean, we know Portal King Lane Kiffin's very aggressive and talent isn't so much an issue, but there's just a lot of new, and that always frightens me a little bit. Week 1, home against Mercer, who cares? Week 2 at Tulane. That's a good Tulane team. Their over-under
Sure.
is 9.5. Come back home the week after that against Georgia Tech, a week before going on the road at Alabama. The Alabama game's probably a loss. I think we could say that rather confidently.
Okay.
The Georgia Tech game sandwiched in between feels very weird to me. I don't think super highly of Georgia Tech, but I'm also not sure what I think of Ole Miss at this juncture. So the Georgia Tech game to me is just odd. In between road tilts against Tulane and Alabama. Come home week 3, Georgia Tech. Week 4, on the road at Bama. Week 5, home against LSU. Week 6, home against Arkansas. Kind of a trappy game in and of itself before going on a bye.
Yeah.
The first half of the season for Ole Miss feels like it is potentially flirting with disaster. Potentially flirting with disaster.
Do you think there's a cliff there, like what happened against LSU last year? Like, do you think there's a game where if they win it, they'll be all right, right? That the autopilot will stabilize. But if something happens in that game that you could see it falling apart?
Honestly,
just because they collapsed last year does not mean they're a collapsing program every year, to be clear. I'm just asking now that we've seen it, because the defense seems like it'll be a high wire act this year. Is there that game you're like, oh man, I could see things going south if this game doesn't work out for them?
Honestly, it's week 2 against Tulane. It's week 2 against Tulane. It's week 2 against Tulane. And Tulane's a good team. I don't think they'll beat Ole Miss, but they've got a veteran quarterback coming back. There's a reason their over-under is pretty high. They're a good team. Beat K-State a year ago, right? So, I don't know. That to me feels like it is a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I'd be concerned about something being off very early on. Now, I think they'll win that game. I think they'll be fine. I think they'll go in probably undefeated to that Alabama game.
Okay.
Even if they lose 2 games back-to-back, Alabama and LSU, they're still in fine shape. It's still okay. But then they've got to stabilize the ship against Arkansas, who we should talk about next, because Arkansas, I think, has one of the more interesting schedules in the SEC. There are other interesting games on the schedule if you're Ole Miss. On the road at Auburn, later in the year when hopefully they get their act together. They're home week 10 against Texas A&M. They're on the road the very next week at Georgia. They close out this thing, obviously, Egg Bowl against Mississippi State. This is probably one of the tougher schedules in the SEC. This, to me, I look at this and I say, I don't know how they're getting out of this. There's also plenty of trap potential here for Ole Miss. Because we did see sort of that cliff effect last year where suddenly it just stopped working. All of it stopped working suddenly, and it was a pretty dramatic drop-off. You could envision a situation in which they go through just the ringer with Alabama and LSU and things fall off the cliff against Arkansas. Or even they go through the ringer with Texas A&M and Georgia, and then to close out the year, things bottom out against Mississippi State.
Well, here's the other thing with Ole Miss's schedule, where everything could turn in a moment's notice. Is as of now they have 3 quarterbacks they feel like could be starters. If the game against Alabama goes terribly, which is certainly on the table, is there a quarterback change there? Are they waiting till the bye week to make a quarterback change? If they're 3-3, I think it's that many weeks in if my records align. So what does an Ole Miss quarterback? Here's my question to you. Does an Ole Miss quarterback start 8 games this year?
Probably not.
Wow.
Probably not.
Okay.
That would surprise me.
I mean,
that would surprise
all
me.
right. This might be your Brian Kelly moment.
It could
where
be Brian Kelly moment.
You have the eternal season-long question about who should actually be starting at quarterback.
Yeah.
All right. That's all. Those are my thoughts there. Where are we going next? A&M, you said?
No, I want to go Arkansas.
Oh, let's go Arkansas. Yeah, for sure.
I want to go. This is possibly the craziest stretch.
This is your fettuccine Alfredo team
This
of the
is
year?
my fettuccine Alfredo stretch, yeah. From week 4 through week 7, here's what we got.
Okay.
They are on the road at LSU week 4. Week 5 is a neutral site game against Texas A&M in Arlington.
Ish. Yeah.
Week 6 on the road at Ole Miss. Week 7 on the road at Alabama. Then they come back home and play Mississippi State before a bye. That's 4 straight weeks away from home. This is a team that also on the schedule has BYU in week 3, which is not an easy non-conference game. After the bye, a little bit later on in the year, they go to Florida and play Florida at Auburn back-to-back. Close out the year in that border war of sorts, whatever it's called. What was the name of the battle line, borderline rivalry? I should know
Which
this.
game?
Against Mizzou?
Oh, yeah. I think it's the battle line. I mean, they've only played it like a handful of times, but
14
yes.
times, whatever.
Yeah.
So not only is there a crazy stretch where they're away from home 4 straight weeks, but also just a lot of tough teams on this thing to begin with. And I know we have questions about Arkansas. I mean, we talked through what those were just a couple episodes ago. So I'm curious to get your take on this because I know you did more of a deep dive on the Hogs.
Mm-hmm.
This is a tester, to say the least.
It is. It's just defense for Arkansas at this moment. So LSU's going to have an offense. Texas A&M, we'll see. Ole Miss will have an offense no matter who's at playing quarterback. We presume Alabama's still going to have an offense. Mississippi State returns enough on offense to make me think they're going to have an offense. So you're absolutely right. And even saying like it's a treacherous stretch, like even with the bye, traveling to the Swamp and then Auburn after the bye immediately, I think the Fettuccine Alfredo stretch continues. So to me, with Arkansas is they're a good team. And if you are an optimist, which I generally like to be with Arkansas football, because I enjoy when Arkansas is good, because they seem chaotic fun, you can go through this schedule and say, I think within reason, or at least ask the question, does Arkansas have the best quarterback today of any team on their schedule? Would all of these teams on Arkansas's schedule, in a heartbeat, accept KJ Jefferson over what they have, presumably, in the shotgun, under center, whatever?
That's a great question.
So the only one that, like, at LSU, if you prefer Jaden Daniels to KJ Jefferson, you're not going to get much of an argument from me. He's a very good quarterback who won the SEC West and came up big in big games last year. So that's fine. So maybe outside of Jaden Daniels, does Arkansas have a better quarterback situation than everybody on their schedule? That's a reason for optimism. Now, KJ Jefferson was beat up last year, and I hate putting everything on a singular talent, especially when the defense likely isn't going to hold up its end of the bargain. You're not going to see a KJ Jefferson-esque defense.
Right.
But it's easy to say, look at this stretch. You know, there's just a lot of quality teams in the SEC. But I don't know. If KJ Jefferson, if they're able to plug in receivers, if the line is better and gives them more time, if the universe is a just universe and evens itself out and allows him to be healthy this year, that's a reason for optimism with Arkansas, despite this schedule. I'm not there because of the defense, but big picture, yeah, I think KJ Jefferson is the better of the quarterback situations on 11 of these 12 teams today, which is something.
That is something. Crazy stretch, though, to say the least.
Yeah, I'm set totally.
Absolutely crazy stretch. Let's talk about A&M now. We've put it off for far too long.
Please.
A&M won 5 games last year. This year, they're over under 7.5. First thing that jumps out to me, good teams on this, right? SEC schedule, but good buffers.
Buffer zone.
Not a whole lot of stuff back to back. That's going to be frightening. They've got a stretch of the neutral sider against Arkansas, followed by Alabama, followed by a road tilt against Tennessee. That's a rough patch.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, they've got Miami week 2 on the road. Miami's over-under is actually higher. I don't know if that means they're a better team than A&M. Probably not, but their over-under is 8. Obviously, that doesn't mean Vegas is expecting their situation to be ramped up fully by week 2, right? Vegas is looking at that and saying that could easily be a loss.
Sure.
The over-under here for A&M at 7.5 to me feels like incredible value. Bye. I'm really in on A&M this year.
Okay, on the over. I was just curious which direction you were alluding to. Yeah.
I could see 9-3. I could see 8-4. I'm not sure about 7-5. 7-5 to me is just too far. That stretch is tough, and I could easily see losses against Alabama and Tennessee. I could even see a loss later in the year on the road to close out this thing against LSU. But honestly, with the amount of talent that they have, there is no reason A&M should not at least be hitting 8 wins with this thing. There's no reason. And look,
copy paste whatever year you choose.
Control C, Control V. Stop me if you've heard this before. I get it.
Yeah.
But again, I can't I can't get myself to that mental place where I'm looking at the schedule and I'm looking at this roster and I'm saying, oh yeah, this team's going 7-5 or worse. I just do not feel that authentically in a way that I'm going to speak it. So tough stretch, but good enough buffers. I feel like they're in a really good spot. They just got to get that offense sorted out. They got Bobby Petrino, like lock Jimbo out of the meeting room when they're putting together their offensive schemes every week. Just keep him away from it. Give him the fake wheel like they gave Dwight on Lake Wall and Paw Pack, whatever. Just keep him away from it. Let him play offense. And provided the offense isn't a disaster, I think they'll be fine to hit that over.
Okay, so couple great things about Texas A&M. One, if you're betting the over, that means you feel good about Connor Wegman and you are hopeful for his health, because if that goes sideways, Texas A&M may go sideways, right? That's the reality at this point. 2, no App State on the schedule.
Great.
Hallelujah.
Great.
Wonderful. Great. 3, their rush defense wasn't great last year, to say the least. We'll see on Miami, but like a lot of these offenses, Alabama's got a good rushing situation. I presume Tennessee will, and that's on the road. But like, I don't know. South Carolina lost guys. Mississippi State is transitioning to a new offense. LSU, we'll see. That wasn't the strength of the team last year as Jaden Daniels led the way. So A&M at 7-5, it's really just quite simple to say, if you think A&M is going to be better than they were last year at 5-7, then saying 8-4 is the easiest and most secure pick for Texas A&M football, because that's what they've been, generally speaking, an 8-4 program when quarterback has been fine and they've had talent on both sides of the ball. They're going to have a crazy good pass rush this year. So I'm not a wagering individual necessarily, but 8-4 feels about right to me.
I'm in, man. I'm in.
But here's my big old butt, Ty. My big old butt is you introduce Bobby Petrino to an ecosystem that is already fragile, we'll say, has some turnover, has had some cultural issues these past couple years, in a matter of speaking. When you introduce a Petrino, specifically the Robert, they're another Cliff team to me, that you spend an entire back half of last year saying, would Texas A&M really buy out Jimbo Fisher? And then you smooth things over a little bit in the offseason because it seems like they found a quarterback of the future. And, you know, they essentially lose a bunch of players to the portal that weren't huge contributors.
I love this. I love this comparison. It's like when you go to Hawaii and you're not supposed to take anything that could harm the ecosystem.
Correct.
I love it.
Right. And so it's already fragile. Yeah. Right? And here we are with a little eyedropper in a Petri dish. Like, we'll see what happens when you add a little bit of active Petrino to an already on edge. That's all I'm saying, Ty. So if I'm going to bring up a Cliff situation with Ole Miss, I'm going to say with Texas A&M, look, the Arkansas game always goes haywire, right? That's always going to go, like, it's always going to turn on a dime. It's always going to go to overtime. So I'm not really worried about that specific game as a Cliff game. There is something about that specific, maybe South Carolina matchup that you're like, well, look, Alabama's tough, Tennessee's tough, Arkansas is always weird. We got to beat South Carolina. If they don't beat South Carolina at home, that to me is the haywire moment for A&M.
What do you think of South Carolina, Dan?
I'm kind of in on Shane Beamer.
Yeah?
I'm kind of in on South Carolina. I don't know that I'm there with. Are you there with the rattle? With Spencer Rattler? Like,
no, I've never been. But
they lose their offensive coordinator to Nebraska. Yes.
Yep.
They had some big transfers, skill position wise, on offense. Was it Marshawn Lloyd and Jaheim Bell?
Yep.
They recruit well, active enough in the portal.
Just a really tough schedule. It's a really tough schedule. And, you know, like, part of me...
it's just always going to have Clemson there. And look, they're on a Clemson winning streak.
They're on a Clemson winning streak. Part of this, to me, when we do the schedule preview, that I don't enjoy is looking at teams that I want to root for year in and year out who just have brutal schedules. And South Carolina often rises to that level. Georgia Tech has been there. We've seen that recently with Arkansas, not necessarily this year, but we've seen that with teams like Arkansas. it just always is a bummer when you're excited about the players and the roster and you look at the schedule and you think there's just no way. Here's the issue I see for South Carolina. They open up the year, neutral site game in Charlotte against North Carolina. That'll be a tough game.
It's must win. It's must win week one.
Must win week one. Now, they've got enough guys to do that. And North Carolina, we still don't know if they're going to play defense this year. They haven't yet.
Ooh, I got to guess.
Why start now? Why start now?
Got a premonition. Yeah.
Why start now? But that could be a wild game. North Carolina can score.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, South Carolina is on the road at Georgia, at Tennessee, at Mizzou and Texas A&M back-to-back a little bit later in the year. That's not to mention there's a game against Florida in there. You could beat Florida. Still a tough game. There's Kentucky at home a week before. They've got Clemson at home. A little bit of a tough stretch there, and Vandy just sort of lurking. South Carolina, again, over under 6.5. I wouldn't want to go anywhere near that. I could see Shane Beamer overperforming again. That has sort of been his calling card the first 2 seasons in Columbia. But this is a tough schedule, man. This is not an easy slate for them by any stretch of the imagination.
It's arrhythmic. So it's North Carolina neutral site, not terribly far away in Charlotte. So then there's no real nice stretches until the Jacksonville State, Vandy, and maybe Kentucky, if they're not good, stretch. It's arrhythmic in that they play 2 home games between Furman and Jacksonville State. Furman's week 2, Jacksonville State's week 10. 2 home games in that stretch. Yeah. And so they're just all over the place. And I'm not geographically all over the place. So I'm in on Shane Beamer as a motivator. I'm in on Shane Beamer as the center of a good cultural squad. I just don't love how this is laid out. So them going 3-2 before the bye, I believe, kind of seems mandatory if they're going to be a team that leaps to like a comfortable bowl team consistently. So they need to go 3-2. If they do go 3-2, winning against Florida is not crazy despite last year. Jacksonville State, Vandy, Kentucky, like you can see 8 wins on this schedule, but they need to start off picking up where they left off to me.
Yeah. And like you said, week 1's must win. It's absolutely must win. And I think they can win. They can beat North Carolina. They absolutely can. But it will test their offense. It will test Spencer Rattler. It will test what they can do on that side of the ball. They have had some turnover there.
North Carolina was not ready to play defense to start the season last year.
No,
perhaps they will be this year.
Not at all. Not anywhere close. We've got 3 teams left. We've got Vandy. We've got Auburn. We've got Mississippi State. Let's talk about Mississippi State. We haven't mentioned a whole lot about Mississippi State. The best thing that I can say about this schedule, Dan, is that I took absolutely no notes on it. I took no notes on it. It wasn't too far a cry from what I'd expect. It wasn't anything that I looked at and I said, wow, that is just a brutal slate. It's about what I'd expect for a team in the SEC West. So the way that this thing is set up, both LSU and Alabama at home, they've got a road game at Texas A&M, which will obviously be challenging, a road game, back-to-back road games after a bye against both Arkansas and Auburn. Their only other road game is at South Carolina week 4. They've got a non-conference game in week 2 against Arizona, which feels like it should be winnable.
They won it last year, but different coach, different system,
Close out the year, obviously, Egg Bowl against Ole Miss. So decent buffers, I think, for the most part. Like, I feel okay about that.
Buffer zone.
I don't see any gigantic traps if you're Mississippi State. The one thing I'd say about Mississippi State, and perhaps this has just been, anecdotal and something that's bothered me about the team over the last couple of years, but it feels like there have been moments where they've let us down, where we expected more. I know you were really high on Mississippi State last year, Dan, and the year before. Feels like you're always high on Mississippi State, and maybe they have not risen to that level for you. So bear in mind, this is, new coach, given circumstances. We wish them well. I'm curious to see how quickly they can get this thing up and running. We know he wants to take things in a bit of a different direction. So I think that in and of itself is a reason to maybe stand back and take a look at things before we come to any conclusions on the Bulldogs. But the schedule as it stands anyway, it's just sort of like very anonymous with respect to the other ones that we've described here today.
I think it's pretty great. I think their schedule's pretty awesome. Okay, so here's what you need to know about Mississippi State. They're on the road once before week 8, right?
That's right. It's exactly right.
So in terms of working in a new head coach and a new system, everything like that, and just the tragic nature of the circumstances surrounding the program, that seems ideal. If they go 4-2 to open the season before the bye, if they do, so that's Southeast Louisiana, Arizona. What do you say? William and Mary is right before the bye.
No, before. I don't know if it's William and Mary or Western Michigan. It's one.
Oh, sorry, I have WMU here.
WMU.
Okay, so tell me who WMU is
find
as
it
I'm
out.
talking.
I'll find it out.
They also have like a gumpiness to their schedule, which is nice. So they're at South Carolina between LSU and Alabama, which is tough. South Carolina has Mississippi State between at Georgia and at Tennessee. That's a nice sandwich situation.
Western Michigan, by the way, I was right.
Western Michigan. Okay,
Yeah.
so if we're saying Mississippi State, they're more talented than Western Michigan. The game is in Stark Vegas. Great. They're on the road against Arkansas after a bye. Arkansas is at Alabama before that game. That's a nice situation.
Right.
Kentucky we circle because that's at home as a potentially winnable game. Kentucky the week before Mississippi State. Tennessee the week after Alabama. That's a little bit gumpy in the West. The Texas A&M game with Mississippi State, I mean, it's Abilene Christian as part of a sandwich, but it's after at Ole Miss for Texas A&M. And then Mississippi State with the Egg Bowl at home, certainly always preferable. So I don't know. I think it aligns relatively well if you consider the very much at home nature of the first 8 weeks, and then situationally where they get some of those potentially winnable games. If Mississippi State is pretty good, it lines up pretty well.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay. I think it's sufficient for Mississippi State.
Yeah.
And it will provide a challenge. Obviously, it always does in the SEC. But over under 6.5, provided it's not a total train wreck, feel pretty good about that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, look, though the back half road-wise are, again, I've used the word high wire a bunch. Arkansas might have an extraordinarily bad defense again.
Yeah.
Auburn might be still finding itself in year one under Hugh Freeze, despite the talent upgrades. Both of those games on the road. Both of those places are very tough to win games. But just in terms of where they are on the schedule, and I mentioned at A&M, adding that droplet of Petrino and getting A&M near the end of the season if things are going poorly for them, that's when I'd prefer to get them. So I don't know. I don't know how good they're going to be, but I don't hate how this is all laid out.
Part of why I'm really intrigued by the SEC is you've got a bunch of teams that Vegas thinks are 6-win or 7-win teams.
Sure.
There's
Rightfully so.
There's a decided ACC feel to that, which means that things could go in any number of 1,000 different directions. Auburn's another one of those teams. Auburn's 6.5, new coach, new circumstances. They've been active in the transfer portal. Auburn has what may be the most interesting stretch. I don't know if it's the toughest, but at a minimum, it's interesting. I still think Arkansas's got that tougher week 4 through week 7 stretch that I described earlier, but Auburn does go to A&M, back home against Georgia, then on a bye, then to LSU before they come back home against Ole Miss, Hugh Freeze's former team. So a little bit more of a storyline if he had to go to Ole Miss, but coming back home, that's a tough stretch for the Auburn Tigers.
I think why you're at that point, that 6-7 win range, how many teams in the SEC of these 14 teams are positive they know what they have at quarterback?
Not that
4?
many. Not
5?
that many.
4.5?
No.
So if you look at the teams here, Florida, no. Georgia, no. Kentucky, no. Mizzou, kind of yes.
Kentucky knows what they have with Devin Leary.
Not for Kentucky.
Okay.
He threw a lot of short passes, won a couple big games.
I don't know if I totally buy that, but continue.
Okay. They know he's of a quality nature, Ty. How about that weird phrasing?
That's factually correct.
So
continue.
Kentucky, Mizzou, South Carolina, I'd say Tennessee, that's 4. Arkansas is 5. LSU 6, if I'm giving you Kentucky. So let's say 6. And then I guess it depends on how you feel about if Jackson Dart is starting, then it's 7. So that's half the teams.
I wouldn't put Mizzou anywhere close to a quarterback
No, I'm just saying they know what they have.
Oh, man.
Not that they're confident in what they have. If you want to say they're confident in what they have, that's a different question.
Yeah.
Mizzou
is not confident in what they have.
I know they're not confident in what they have, but at least they can game plan to what they perceive to be Brady Cook's strengths.
Sure.
If he is, again, the starter.
Sure.
I don't know. They brought in Jake Garcia?
Jake Garcia, yep.
Okay. So I'm just saying, I think that's a reason why. I think, a lot a lot hinges a lot. There's sort of a quarterback seesaw in the conference right now. And then look, I think we know what we have in Connor Wegman for A&M, but adding in Bobby Petrino, and I don't know, I'm not positive we do. So that's why I think we're up in that air, that there's just not a lot known about what these teams are going to look like.
Yeah, and Auburn's in the same boat. You know?
Of course.
I mean, Auburn took on Peyton Thorne. That was the big.
I don't know what if they know what they have in him.
No, I don't know if we know what we have in him.
Sure.
We know that Peyton Thorne has been effective in spots. We know that he's been a gamer in spots for Michigan State before he transferred down. I'm presuming maybe he's got more talent around him at Auburn. I don't know if we can say that definitively. It's year one under Hugh Freeze, and there's been a lot of roster turnover.
I'm also positive Michigan State fans watched Michigan State games last year and watched the passing game and turned off the TV at times.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So here's what I like for Auburn, okay?
Yeah.
With all that being said, UMass on the road at Cal and Samford. First 3 weeks of the season, that gives them a chance to soft launch whatever new thing they're trying to install. Right?
Okay.
Soft launch it, get your schemes up and running before you got to go on the road to A&M, and then to Georgia, then to bye, then on the road to LSU. That's when it gets tough after week 3. But that gives them at least enough of an opportunity to get things going in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I have no comment on Auburn in terms of where the roster's at, what the systems look like with a new coach, new coordinators, everything, maybe a new full-time starting quarterback. If they go 3-2 to start the season, if they go 4-1, that means they're beating A&M likely on the road.
Right.
That's a huge success story. But the stretch of A&M, Georgia, bye week, LSU, the Mississippi schools, that's a meaty middle, Ty. It's a meaty middle. Although, I don't hate how this schedule lands. I mean, I'm still talking about the Mississippi schools at Vanderbilt, at Arkansas, New Mexico State, Alabama. I don't hate it. There's too much up in the air for me, and I don't trust where they are at quarterback. And so, I don't know. If they're a bowl team this year, if they go 7-5, I say, great.
Yeah.
Great first step. That's where they should be. This is a tough schedule. Well, after the UMass Cal Samford, whatever you call it, the soft launch. Yeah.
After the soft launch, yeah, of course. Close things out with Vandy.
I'm not even sold on them beating Cal.
No?
No.
Interesting.
Cal could beat Auburn and go 2-10. Because that would be just an extraordinarily Cal thing to do.
That'd be very Cal.
Yeah.
Final team here is Vandy. Vandy's over-unders.
Justin Wilcox exclusively wins in September. Yeah.
Final team here is Vandy. Over-unders 3.5.
Yes.
Vandy has the distinction of having the easiest 4-game stretch to start its season. They go...
Okay.
They're going against Hawaii week 0. Then Alabama A&M the following week. At Wake, at UNLV. First 4 games of the season. Now, when I say the easiest 4-game stretch to start its season, I'm not saying Vandy will go 4-0. I'm just saying relative to other SEC teams that have, a couple teams they should beat in the first couple weeks of the season, Vandy's appears to be the easiest. Maybe it is drawn to scale given where Vandy's been at these last couple of years. Right. After week 3, it toughens up. Then they start getting into their SEC schedule. It's not horrible. It's not horrible in terms of the home road split. I'm not saying they're going to go 7-5. I'm just saying their road games are Florida, Ole Miss, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Decent buffers in between. Does not appear to me like there is any kind of murderer's row here. There's back-to-back weeks against Florida, Georgia. This is all to say we're still talking about Vandy, so maybe keep things in perspective, Ty.
Sure.
I get that. I'm just saying they could start off, they could win a couple games, and if you are thinking of this from the perspective of over-unders, Vandy was plucky in moments last year. There is a world in which Vandy wins 3 games to start its season. Vandy goes 3-1 to start its season, and they only need to win one somewhere the rest of the way. Maybe it's on the road at South Carolina. Maybe it's home against Auburn. Maybe it's a game against Missouri or Kentucky. But there is a world in which they could hit that over relatively early on in the season and then not win any other games.
Are you not a Timmy Chang believer? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
I may not be a Timmy Chang believer, no.
Yeah, it is kind of funny when a team has a must-win September. Because if you're trying to get to a bowl game, if you're trying to get closer to a bowl game and amass 4 or 5 wins and hope for a 6 and a 50-50 matchup, I'm kind of enamored with the Vandy over.
Yeah,
I don't hate the September must-win situation. We'll see on Wake. I just think it's very easy annually to say like, Wake. Well, who's Wake? What's Wake going to do? And they just keep winning games and pushing around better teams, even in losing efforts. So I'm not writing in Wake, as I'm not sure you are either, but like getting Kentucky when they do, getting Mizzou when they do, getting Auburn when they do, like it's a nice, you'd rather get your more winnable games at home. I know that goes counter to some line of thinking, but I don't know. It's really secure the wins.
If you're Vandy,
when you're
you'll
desperate
take it,
for 'em.
right? If you're Vandy, you'll take it.
So I'm kind of enamored with the over right now.
The over feels...
They do have teams. They do have teams at ideal spots.
I think I'm in on Vandy, 3.5. Yeah.
Yeah.
This could morph into an over-under show anyway. If it does, I apologize, but
that's okay. The problem is I think we took a lot of overs and we need to hit some unders here as well. So we can do that on another show, but I don't know. Auburn feels like a candidate right now to me.
Auburn,
an under candidate.
I think Mizzou,
excuse me.
Mizzou's a good candidate for under.
Mizzou's a good candidate. Ole Miss might be a good candidate.
Yeah.
Kentucky quietly might be a good candidate, but I hate that they start with Ball State, Eastern Kentucky, and Akron, so they might just hack their way to 7 wins. Yeah. All right. Fair enough.
Of all the teams that we discussed here, in the wide world of SEC football, which is the singular most interesting team for you given what we're discussing here, given schedule, given circumstances, given whatever? If you have to pick one out, right? We've already called out easiest and some of the toughest and craziest stretches and gumpiness and trappies and oddballs and all that stuff. But which is the one team that when you went through this raised your eyebrows the most?
Oh, A&M.
Yeah.
It's easily A&M, both because of what the roster looks like, what the coaching staff looks like, but getting that week 2 opponent in Miami, at Miami, having that Arkansas game as always like a crazy game, getting to see Auburn early on. Is that Auburn's? Yeah, that's Auburn's first, like, not to throw shade at Cal or whoever, but that's Auburn's first real game. Right. So we'll get a great sense of Auburn via A&M. Getting Alabama at home is great. The game against Tennessee at Tennessee the following week is great. I love that stretch. I love that Auburn, Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee stretch. And I just think there is more potential for entertainment with A&M's schedule than most of the teams across the conference.
Yeah.
I think they're fascinating.
For me, it's Florida. I think it's an easy one. It's Florida. The schedule, if you're a Florida fan, the schedule features some of the better teams in the country. It's a great schedule. Just as a casual observer, maybe if you're not a Florida fan, it's better. But there's a lot of high-profile matchups on this thing. And so that makes it in and of itself interesting. And because of the way this thing is spaced out, not necessarily a murderer's row.
Wounders, baby. Wounders row.
Wounders row is very much in play for the Florida Gators. Every other week there is a good matchup. I still feel pretty adamantly that 5.5 sells them short. I still believe a great deal in Billy Napier. But you could very easily see a world in which, Florida's 3-3? 3-3 going into week 6. And everyone's wondering, like, what the hell? What the hell? Is this thing going to turn around or?
Week 7. Yeah.
Whatever, right?
Yeah, going into week 7, yeah.
So Florida for me.
Florida for you is fascinating. I considered Florida, the problem when you ask, like, whose schedule is fascinating, I have to consider Graham Mertz. I have to factor the Mertz factor into the equation.
I know.
And I prefer not to at this moment, at this juncture.
Write in solidverbal@gmail.com. Let us know who is of interest to you. Alongside this episode, we'll post a schedule matrix so that you can follow along. I know it's tough to listen to all of these games and not have a visual for it. So we will make sure that we include that for folks who are interested in playing the home game. Don't forget to make sure you're going out to verballers.com. Check out our Patreon if you want to further support the show. We're going to start ramping up off-season and preseason benefits here before long. We've got a lot of excitement in the works. You're going to have to take my word for it. We've been very, very busy here. Very, very busy when we're not rolling the mics. Also, make sure you follow along on social media where we post some additional commentary. And, of course, last but certainly not least, going out to quickslants.solidverbal.com or just to our website, solidverbal.com. Yeah. Sign up for our newsletter. We send it out once a week. We're doing our best to keep you up to speed with all things going on in and around the world of college football on a weekly basis.
We're adding a trivia component to the
We're adding a
newsletter
trivia.
as well.
We added a trivia component on the Thursday newsletter. This coming Thursday, we'll give a couple shout outs to folks who got that question right. Great question from you, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great,
if you're
great
a trivia
question.
head,
Great.
If you're a trivia head, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to try to pull in some sort of prize situation. I'd say the answer to that question, will there be prizes? quickslants.solidverbal.com will be, I think, a pertinent bit of information. And to be clear, this episode is not our SEC preview episode.
No.
This is our SEC schedule preview.
That's right.
Come July and August, that's when we're going to be talking more about, personnel groupings and schedule and how we feel about certain players and how we there's going to be a proper team by team preview of every team.
That's
come
correct.
July, August. This is just a look at the rungs.
The
on
preview
ladder.
to the preview, let's say.
The preview to the preview. Did you have a rehearsal to the rehearsal dinner before your wedding?
No.
Like, what day of the week did you get married?
Got married on a Saturday.
So there was no Thursday night tight family, Friday night extended rehearsal.
No. 2 days was enough.
We had
man.
that.
2
We
days
had a
was enough.
rehearsal to the rehearsal.
Beautiful.
Tight, 14 people, and then there was a rehearsal dinner with however many dozens of people, and then it was the wedding. Yeah, we definitely did that. So this is the rehearsal to the rehearsal.
Rehearsal to the rehearsal. For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty
Yes.
Hildebrand. Tune in next episode. We're talking all things Big Ten schedule. We'll talk to you soon. Stay solid.
Peace.